Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our From the Field Farm Chat with Idaho Wheat. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ryan Mortensen. I am the Communications and Programs Manager for the Idaho Wheat Commission. And today we have joining us from US Wheat Associates, Peter Laudeman. And Peter is the Director of Trade and Policy for US Wheat Associates. Today we're going to talk about US Wheat and their role in food aid, the current status of food aid, and how the current status of food aid could affect farmers going forward and the future of food aid. Before we get started, Peter, I just want to remind those who are joining us to, if you have questions, please unmute your microphone or put a question in the chat or raise your hand icon, and we will make sure to get those questions answered for you from Peter. And then Peter, before we start off, if you just want to give an introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive right into our conversation about food aid.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate you taking the time to have me on here and talk a little bit about food aid. Like Ryan said, I'm Peter Laudeman. I'm the Director of Trade Policy for US Wheat Associates based out of the Arlington, Virginia office right across the river from Washington, D.C. Been with US Wheat in that role for just about 3 years now. And have been in DC and some other kind of ag policy roles prior to that, but spent a good chunk of my time on the full spectrum of trade policies, whether that's tariffs or transportation policy, but increasingly more and more time on food aid policy in particular, as it's pretty important to some of the work that we're doing in the export world.
Thanks, Peter. So I know that you're actually, it's important to note, Peter's actually in Cape Town right now, where he just has given or is about to give a presentation on food aid.
Yeah, spot on, Ryan. Yeah, just a little bit earlier this afternoon here in Cape Town, gave a presentation to kind of some flour mills and wheat buyers from across sub-Saharan Africa, talking a little bit about some of the food aid programs that the U.S. government offers and kind of how they can have a relationship not just with wheat farmers in the United States, but also has some opportunities for them from a commercial perspective as well. I think it was largely well received. It was right after the lunch hour, but everybody seemed to stay awake. So I think it was a pretty good opportunity. Had some mills there that have participated in those programs in the past. So it was a pretty receptive audience, and they're definitely anxiously awaiting kind of what food aid programs will look like in the near future.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to talk with you today. Can you kind of elaborate on what you shared during that presentation on what the current status of food aid is and maybe where you think it's going?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll give you the nutshell and happy to dive in further to anything that's of interest. But we saw, kind of going back to President Trump's first day of his second term, a variety of executive orders from kind of a full spectrum of policy areas. But one of those was how the U.S. engages in foreign aid. And so he had an executive order that effectively paused any foreign aid, both at USAID, but really across the entire federal government, for 90 days to say, we've gotten a little bit off track for kind of how we're engaging in foreign aid. We need to pause for 90 days, review what we're doing, and chart a little bit clearer path forward. There was definitely a few kind of hiccups along the way, but in many ways that kind of echoes some of the sentiments that US Wheat has been saying for a long time, that we've just gotten a little off track from some of the messages that certainly U.S. farmers have been trying to share with USAID and how to make these programs work best for U.S. constituencies. And so we engaged pretty quickly in that sort of 90-day pause process to say, hey, what works, what doesn't work, what's the path going to be moving forward. At the kind of other end of that, we're still kind of untangling kind of what the future is going to be. Certainly, USAID as an independent agency is not going to be in existence any longer. They've got a substantially reduced footprint in terms of staff. And there's a substantially reduced amount of programs that they're going to operate. But the kind of opportunity that we see from the wheat side is the big program that USAID was operating on the food aid front was Food for Peace. And we've been working pretty hard to find an opportunity to move that program entirely under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That's something that we've kind of, theorized in the past and had opportunities to think about. But this is the reality to be able to make that move. And so it's a pretty exciting time to be able to refocus our programs a little bit and take programs that bought a little bit of food from the US, bought a lot of food from other countries, gave away a lot of cash, and instead say, how do we refocus this to buy as much food from the United States as possible, to feed as many people as possible? And I think we've got some pretty big opportunities to do that across the board.
Peter,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Brittany.
Sorry, Ryan. Was Food for Peace initially under the purview of USDA when that program was started?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'll even take it a slight step further back that if folks want kind of the origin story of Food for Peace, in 1953, there was a farmer in Cheyenne County, Kansas, that came to his county farm bureau meeting and basically said, hey, wheat prices are pretty horrible right now. We know there's a whole world of people that don't have food to eat. How can we use this as a sort of win-win relationship to help out the wheat market and help out people in need? And that was kind of the very beginning of Food for Peace. It was signed into law by President Eisenhower just the next year, another Kansan. And since then, we've changed the scope a little bit of how the program operates. So we're not trying to make it a sort of supply control program, but it still has that win-win where you have a beneficial relationship with U.S. farmers and U.S. constituencies, as well as that humanitarian objective. Certainly in the beginning, there was always a sort of push and pull between USDA, between the State Department, between the White House independently on who's going to control this, how do we operate this program. Certainly in the past and even the recent past, USDA has wholly operated Food for Peace, especially under Title I, so kind of one version of how that program can work. It's only been in kind of more recent years that USAID has taken control when that program moved from Title I into Title II, which was just a little bit different way to structure the program. So USDA can absolutely do this. They've done it historically. Our efforts have certainly encouraged the administration to make sure that not only the program moves to USDA, but that they have the resources to do that. And so I think we've got some huge opportunity there.
With this change, Peter, how might shifting the Food for Peace program to USA impact American farmers and or the domestic foreign market?
Yeah, I think that's the real core question. And so I would maybe frame it as under USAID, certainly in recent years, roughly 30-ish% of the Food for Peace budget went to actually buy food. And then the other 70% was sort of other costs. Some of those costs are definitely essential. You can't just buy the food. You have to ship it to where it needs to go. You have to have staff to be able to move it. But 70% overhead's pretty high. I mean, when we look at a commercial market relationship, there's no commercial market in the world that would have that type of margin relationship and be able to be successful. And so I think as we look at moving it to USDA, there's just a way more attentive staff that cares about what farmers think. USAID would talk about caring about what farmers think, but never really did a lot of acting to kind of put things back in the direction that we were hoping that they would move in. And so under USDA, I think we have much better opportunity to make sure that farmers have a voice at the table and make sure that we're making these programs as efficient and effective as possible. And that's something that we've been pushing for a long time, but just never really had the right angle with USAID that we'll absolutely have at USDA.
What kind of implications are you seeing? I know there was a pause on food aid. That pause was stopped. What kind of implications have you guys been seeing with the current administration and those changes that have come along?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think one thing to remember is that the U.S. government has been historically the most generous country by far in terms of U.S. food assistance or international food assistance. A lot of metrics would say that the U.S. government basically was giving more food assistance than the rest of the world combined. And so when we saw this sort of pause and reshuffling of foreign aid, it's been pretty limited to see any cuts in the food aid space. If there's any sort of foreign aid programs that have continued to operate, it's been the international food assistance programs, and we're really proud of that. There's just been a few kind of pauses along the way, reviews of kind of how we're going to operate, and kind of shows just how reliant we are on the U.S. alone to kind of fund some of those programs. And so we took a group of farmers just last week to Kenya, where we visited a refugee camp with the World Food Program. had seen where even before any sort of changes in U.S. funding, they had already scaled back to about 40% of what a full caloric ration would be. And so this is not, 100% being, a great steak and potatoes meal. 100% is basically the bare minimum of sort of staple high carb calories to get you through a month. And instead, they're only able to give 40% of that. And they're really anticipating that within the next couple of months, it's probably going to cut in half to only 20%. And so there's no doubt that there's an incredible need. As we look across the world at places that we're providing food aid, Kenya is probably one of the most stable and most secure in general. And the fact that they're cutting back to a 20% ration when you have much more unstable situations in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, and other places around the world, there's no doubt that there's enormous need for food aid. We're really excited about moving that program to USDA and moving really quickly to say we know where the need is. We know they can use wheat. How do we get that from point A to point B as quickly as possible? And so hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to have a little bit more of a sort of success story to share.
Yeah.
Can you talk for a minute about how that program moves from USAID to USDA? What are the steps it has to go through, and where are we in the process?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's probably a few different angles. One is congressional legislation. So there's bills that have been introduced in both the House and the Senate and Congress that would legislatively move all of the sort of authorities and resources and liabilities of USAID under the Food for Peace program over to USDA. So sort of anything that was under the authority of the USAID administrator gets replaced with the Secretary of Agriculture. That's one flavor of how we've been doing that. There's been tremendous support in Congress and in both the House and the Senate for those bills, and they've been making a lot of progress. The other opportunity is to have the administration just sort of do it through executive action, and then they can codify it later. So we've engaged directly with Secretary Rollins at USDA, Secretary Rubio at the State Department, to say, hey, how do we find ways to just move this along as quickly as possible, and then we can codify it in Congress later. Believe it or not, Congress isn't always the quickest acting on these types of things. There's very few legislative vehicles that are going to be able to move forward this year. And so we're really kind of channeling both of those directions right now. Both of them have made a lot of progress, even within this last week. And so we think that we're building the right kind of momentum to get that done very quickly here. It's a great opportunity for folks that are listening that don't have their members of Congress signed on to those bills in Congress. That's hugely supportive. So definitely encourage that.
Question from the chat, Peter. How does or did the PL 480 program complement Food for Peace? And what is left of that program?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll try not to get super technical here. So the food aid world has a lot of sort of semi-synonymous terms that sort of mean the same thing, but not really. So sometimes we use Food for Peace, Title II, PL 480, all independently. PL 480 is the public law, so the statute of the Food for Peace Act that sort of lays out all of the authorities of what you can do in Food for Peace. And I think I mentioned Title I, mentioned Title II. There's some other titles to the Food for Peace Act that have a bunch of different sort of flavors of how we can do food assistance. I think what the question is probably mostly getting at is that sort of Title I question, how we used to operate some food aid programs, and that was primarily under concessional sales. So today we basically buy the food as the U.S. government, donate it through an NGO to sort of a refugee camp or other population, and it's just kind of as simple as that. We've previously operated under Title I, that was something called concessional sales. So you basically would be a government-to-government transaction. So the U.S. government would engage with the government of another country that has a food shortage and be able to sell them the product in their local currency and sometimes at a discount. So basically more of a government-to-government financial aid situation that has a little bit more of a direct tie versus kind of the NGO intermediary. Again, got probably a little bit in the weeds there, and happy to kind of dive into any more of that more, but whatever's helpful.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know US Wheat has a mission to keep food in food aid. Can you talk about why in lieu of food, the cash donations or contributions are being substituted?
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great question, and I think you look at food aid, and for probably the average person, and certainly the average American, if you hear that we're giving food assistance to another country, you say, "Oh, we're giving them food," and it's definitely not been as simple as that in the last 10 years, certainly the last 20 years. What started as a program that was exclusively food oriented and exclusively food from the United States has been substantially expanded over time. So you've got kind of a whole suite of different food aid programs in the U.S. government, and Food for Peace is the one that works best. That still mostly buys U.S. food and gives it to hungry people. But there's also other programs that are focused on sometimes they would say flexibility or different modalities, and so instead of sending food from the United States, they might send it from another region. Certainly, if that's something that's buying fresh fruits and vegetables from a nearby community to the one being served, that's something U.S. Wheat can support. But if you're going and buying wheat from Canada or Australia or another major international exporter, that's not something we think is good policy at all. And then even beyond that sort of sourcing with international markets, there's also cash donations. Sometimes even cash can have its place. You might give a small amount, $2 a month, to be able to buy salt or spices to incorporate into the food ration alongside food. But when you entirely replace food with just a cash donation, especially in places that you can't track where that's being spent or how that's being spent, or really even who the money is going to, we have a tremendous problem with the accountability that's behind that effort, as well as the fact that you're cutting out any sort of use of the U.S. grown food supply generally. So when we say put the food back in food aid, it's saying let's make this just as simple as everybody thinks it needs to be. As any logic would have it, and say if they're starving people, let's send them food from the United States and not add other layers to this dynamic that aren't helpful and in fact can be very harmful to the interests that we're trying to accomplish through these programs.
I know we have a lot of regions where they can't grow wheat due to climate, due to typography. How does US Wheat prioritize these areas in how they're contributing food aid?
Yep, absolutely. So there's kind of always a little bit of a push and pull dynamic between the sort of teach a man to fish versus give him a fish. And it's a little bit of a different analogy in this case because exactly like you're saying, not everywhere grows wheat really well. And so we've definitely seen some programs over time where we've invested millions of dollars from the U.S. government, the U.S. taxpayer, trying to grow wheat in places that still do not grow wheat well and will never grow well. U.S. Wheat is definitely much more supportive of an angle that's saying let's take a more logical approach. If we can support them in agricultural production for things that they have a comparative advantage in, that's great. But the United States has a comparative advantage in growing wheat. And so if we're one of the best countries in the world at growing wheat, we don't need to be building up a competitor that's never really going to be able to do it well. And so when we look across the world and across the different U.S. wheat offices around the world, we're really, really careful about finding places that are viable commercial markets versus places that may or may not be able to grow wheat themselves. And so we never want to disrupt a commercial market. We never want to send somebody a product that they don't need or they don't want. But there's definitely a lot more value to establishing an international trade relationship than there is investing money in trying to grow food that's never gonna grow well in a country that you're looking at.
Going back to the World Food Program and its ration cut, I mean, you're saying a potential 60% ration cut could be coming.
Yeah. So World Food Program is in a pretty kind of tight spot. So they've historically received an enormous amount of funding from the United States, as well as funding from other governments, from private donors. They've seen a lot of cuts for a lot of different reasons. Some of that is a little bit of this pause from the U.S. government, but they've also had pauses dependent on kind of the particular regions or countries they're interested in. So as we've seen sort of the Russia-Ukraine war escalate, there's been a lot more donors that are interested in funding Ukraine, and maybe that draws funding away from other countries that they're working in. So the World Food Program's had a lot of different sort of budgetary constraints and changes in funding over especially the last sort of 3-4 years. And so they were already going through some pretty drastic cuts. Compounding that with a limit on U.S. resources, at least in the short term, they're just in a pretty tight spot as they look around the world at trying to meet a lot of different challenges with a very limited amount of resources. I mean, they're working more and more in regions that are very conflict driven. So you're having civil wars or inter-country wars, places that people are actively killing each other. Those are hard places to provide food assistance. And so it costs a lot of money to be able to do that safely and securely. And they're just really working hard to sort of prioritize where can we do this well, where can we not do this well. And again, Kenya, who's one of those most stable countries, even there, they're cutting back to 20% of a ration. I think I was there a year ago, and they were cut back to a 65% ration, which was already dramatically low. And now they're at 40%, coming to 20% soon. That's dropping quickly. The two major refugee camps in Kenya are the one that we visited that has about 300,000 people from countries all over sort of Central Eastern Africa. Huge potential for sort of that turning to a violent direction if there's people without food. And that's probably the safer refugee camp. The other one in Kenya is closer to the border of Somalia, where most of them are Somalian refugees from the conflict in that region. There's actively now al-Shabaab terrorists in that refugee camp. And so when you look at cutting back to a 20% ration of food to a population that's already sort of under the influence of an active terrorist organization, you have a really dangerous recipe for what's supposed to be one of the safest, most U.S. allied countries in Africa, and instead could quickly turn into a 700,000 person plus population that has no food and has a lot of violent influence.
So U.S. commodities obviously are going to be critical with these ration cuts. What kind of a role would wheat play in this situation?
Yeah, so I think if there's any takeaway, it's this team that we brought to Kenya last week. I think was pretty strongly impacted by what they saw in this refugee camp. I mean, nobody could be able to go there and not be impacted. It's a pretty unique and challenging circumstance to be able to see in person. I think if there's any takeaway from that group, everybody is 100% committed to saying, what can we do to help this situation? How do we make this work? And that's shipping commodities from the United States as quickly as possible. The way that we look at it at US Wheat is we'd love to do it today, but without that sort of leadership right now to be able to do it, we just can't make anything move. So there is no USAID, but the State Department hasn't really taken control of Food for Peace. We want it to go over to USDA, and that's why we're pushing so hard in that direction, because we think on day one of USDA having control of the Food for Peace program, they can start running every check, every process they need to do to say what are the existing authorities, what are the existing financial resources that we can move U.S. shipments as quickly as possible. There's been a lot of historical complaints, especially from USAID or the NGO community, that U.S. commodities are too slow. And that's always kind of confused us on the U.S. wheat side, because we see commercial shipments all the time. We know what shipping timeframes take. We know what it takes to source wheat from across the country at very specific contract specs, and it's never really made sense. And so we think if we have this entirely under USDA, we'll be able to move a lot quicker than some of these unnecessary checks and balances, unnecessary red tape that slowed things down in the past. And instead be able to get food on the water as quickly as possible to get where it needs to go. Kenya is certainly the one that we saw, but I'm sure there's virtually infinite opportunities for the World Food Program and other major NGOs to be able to make use of U.S. commodities.
Yeah. Is this proposed transition or the current status of food aid, is it having any effect on farmers currently?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a good and the bad there. So maybe the good is there's not a lot of super short-term direct financial impact. The bad is the reason for that is probably about a year and a half ago, USAID substantially reduced the amount of wheat that they were buying. That's for a couple of different reasons that I'm more than happy to get into. But we saw from basically a 1 million ton per marketing year peak down to almost nothing in this marketing year. That's a enormous drop. That's been a huge challenge. And so in many ways, we already saw the decrease, and now we're just kind of sitting in a unfortunately low status quo while there's people starving all around the world. And as soon as we can get the policy in the right place, I think we're going to see those numbers boost back up and have real opportunity to make a difference.
Peter, are there any other pieces of USAID that might be transferred to USDA, such as support for CGIAR and international ag research to increase food security?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and probably the multi-billion-dollar question that a lot of people are asking right now. I briefly mentioned that there's certainly other food aid programs in the U.S. government. Some of them are already at USDA, so Food for Progress, McGovern-Dole, those are and always have been 100% USDA programs. Food for Peace is the one that we're most focused on, simply because it's the emergency food assistance program. There's a lot more resources when you think about certainly CGIAR, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has agriculture components, the Feed the Future Labs. There's a lot of different layers that we can kind of, I think, unpack and reevaluate over time. Our near-term first priority is Food for Peace so that we can get the emergency situations taken care of. And then I think there's a little bit broader review to say, what does the U.S. government's broader food assistance and agriculture assistance portfolio looks like? How does it work best for U.S. farmers? How do we make sure that it can work in a way that's going to make sense? And that's probably a little bit more medium to long-term conversation.
You mentioned earlier the adage of teaching a person to fish or giving a person fish. One of the questions that comes up fairly frequently when we talk about food aid and U.S. wheat being sent to other countries for food security is, well, what are we getting out of this? What does this do for us? Are there success stories that are linked to food aid, and can you talk about them?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll give you a couple of examples, but there's certainly many more. The easiest one is this type of refugee food assistance from Food for Peace, or that emergency food assistance where you're literally giving physical food to people in need. That has translated historically into the Philippines being the #2 U.S. wheat customer every single year now on a commercial basis. So the Philippines started as a food aid market. We gave them wheat for free. They developed a taste for our product, and as their economy has developed, they've continuously bought U.S. wheat. There's mills in the Philippines that are buying 100% U.S. wheat, and so there's an enormous, not even long-term, but really short-term market building potential, depending on the country that you're in. There's another type of program, Food for Progress, that's run by USDA. That's a little bit less of the direct emergency feeding food assistance. It's more of a sort of win-win relationship where you're buying wheat in the United States and then you sell it to another country, and then you take the proceeds from that sale to fund a sort of charitable project in their agriculture sector. That's another sort of win-win where the U.S. benefit, in this case, we've looked at success stories in Colombia, for example, has opportunities where we've certainly shipped wheat commercially to Colombia before, but that program in particular, because it's a sort of facilitated government sale, allowed us to get U.S. wheat into different ports in different parts of the country that otherwise would never have U.S. wheat. And then they develop this taste for that, and again, see that it's commercially possible and buy on a commercial basis. So there's enormous market building potential, as well as what Secretary Rubio likes to say is any foreign assistance that we need to do, food aid or otherwise, needs to be making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. I think every single one of those pillars fits very, very strongly with exactly U.S. food aid programs, especially ones that buy U.S. commodities. You're making us safer because you're feeding populations that otherwise would quickly turn to violence without food. You're making America stronger because you're building a trading relationship with somebody that then says, hey, the U.S. government is my source of food security. We have a strong relationship here with the United States, not with Russia, not with India, not with other countries. And then when it comes to prosperity and making America more prosperous, you have a direct financial relationship with not just the U.S. farmer, but across the U.S. agriculture value chain, from farmers to processors to shippers to labor unions that work on U.S. flagged vessels. There's a whole series of benefits that turns back to the U.S. economy.
One last question here for you, Peter. Some options or ways that wheat producers or other commodity groups can get more involved in these policy decisions and involved in the future of international food aid.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, we have these bills in Congress. They're fantastic. Your local congressman should support them. Your state senators should support them. And so I think there's great opportunity for you to call those offices and say, hey, U.S. international food aid programs, and especially Food for Peace, are good for Idaho farmers. And that program is going to work best under USDA. And so the extent that you have to have opportunities to share that message that this isn't just a free giveaway, this isn't something that doesn't have a relationship to the U.S., but that the best way for these programs to work is making sure that they're buying American commodities, sending them overseas in the largest volumes possible. That's what you need to be talking to your legislators about. I think we've got tremendous resources for you in terms of talking points and communications ideas if you want more details. But anything that you can do, I promise your senators, your congressmen care a lot more about hearing from you than they do hearing from me or hearing from the National Association of Wheat Growers. It makes a big difference when you're an actual constituent able to carry that message.
Overall, do you see a lot of support for food aid from the Idaho delegation?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the vast majority of the Idaho delegation has been super strong supporters. We've got a really unique situation where certainly Senator Risch, the senior senator from Idaho, is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and so he's got a unique voice in sort of these foreign policy discussions. To be super candid, I think at the senator's level, he's a huge champion for Idaho farmers. He does have maybe some unique staff perspectives, especially on his sort of foreign relations committee that gets a little bit outside of just Idaho specific and into kind of more broad U.S. foreign policy. And so he's probably got some individual staffers that don't quite see the Idaho farmer perspective. And so again, I think Senator Risch has been a huge champion himself, but the more that he can hear in particular from farmers that say Food for Peace is important, needs to be at USDA, that's an enormous opportunity.
Yeah.
Great, we'll do that.
All right, Peter Laudeman from US Wheat. Thanks so much, Peter. We appreciate your comments, your knowledge, your wisdom. Appreciate your time joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure and really appreciate the time.